Welcome to Active and Critical Reading Strategies. This is an activity or a lesson that we are going to talk about that allows us to think about our reading process as a way of perhaps mining and talking to our text. In our first module, you spent some time looking at or reflecting on your own critical reading process, and you wrote up a quick reflection based on a survey. So now what we want to do is we want to look at or dive into some of the active and critical reading strategies that we want to strengthen or infuse in our own process as we walk through this semester. To prepare for this video, you want to make sure that you have everything that you need in order to take effective notes. That would mean paper, pencil, pen. If you are someone that likes to take notes digitally, then perhaps you have a split screen going on where you've got the video on one side and some kind of digital document, perhaps Word or Google Docs open on the other, so that you can effectively take notes for this video. So our guiding questions for this particular video include: what does it mean to be an active reader? What are active reading strategies? And by the end of this lesson, what I would love for you to walk away with or understand is how to apply active reading strategies to effectively highlight and annotate a text using a process that best fits your preferred learning style. So while we're going to walk through some strategies for highlighting and annotating or mining and talking to the text, the way in which you do that should be meaningful to you. So you begin to incorporate things that make sense for your learning styles. You may already have several strategies that you use that work wonderfully, and that's great. You may find some ideas throughout this lesson that you think might better strengthen that process. That's great too. So when we think about active readers, we think about a couple of characteristics. One, active readers set a purpose. If you've ever been reading a page of a book and looked up and realized after a page or two you have no idea what it says. It happens to me all the time, where you are reading the words and they're going in, but your mind is somewhere else. Perhaps you're having a busy day. You've got a lot on your to-do list, and so you're not able to really attend to the task at hand or engaging deeply into the text. So you're technically reading because you're decoding the words. You know what those words say. But because of some distractions or because you don't have a purpose set for that reading, you are not connecting to that reading or the content. So setting a purpose. Develop pre-reading strategies. We're going to go into these. We're going to take a look at what we mean by that. And everybody's pre-reading strategies are a little bit different. But we are going to break up this active reading process into things that come before, during, and after the reading. Engaging in the text. Think about what you're reading. Ask questions as you read. Look for the author's main points. And then, of course, look for supporting details. So each of these ways or each of these ideas are ways in which we can think about making sure that we are active versus passive when we read. So when we look at critical reading strategies, things that you can do as you read, you can do things like previewing. We're going to dive into that a little bit more in just a minute. Contextualizing. When we contextualize, you start looking at a particular text as it relates to something. What is the context? What is it adding to? You'll do that through kind of engaging with what's the topic or subject matter of this particular text. Questioning to understand and remember. Many times as you read, you may have questions for the author, so we can jot those down, in essence, talking to the text. Connecting to it. What in the text reminds you of something that you've seen before, you've heard before, you've read before? How can you connect your own prior knowledge or lived experiences with what the author is talking about? You also want to reflect on challenges to your beliefs and values. So examine your own personal responses. How is this text making you feel? Is it challenging something that you disagree with, or is it validating something that you agree with? Doing things like outlining and summarizing. Evaluating an argument. Do you believe that the author had enough evidence to support his or her argument? Did they present enough that made you believe what he or she was trying to do? Comparing and contrasting relating readings. And we can look at that in a way of connecting as well, because you're looking at it in terms of how perhaps two texts are similar or how they are different. So when we think about taking those critical reading strategies, we're going to break them up into things that we do before we read, while we read, and after we read. And so if we're passive readers, we just begin reading. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And if you're engaged or you have a novel that you're reading or a book that you're reading that you are reading, let's say you have no plans to write about it in an academic sense, or you are reading it because you are on vacation and this could be a very enjoyable book. Even in that sense, you're still not passive because you chose the book for a reason, right? So you still are engaging in that active process. But if we're actively reading, we're going to preview the text. In essence, you're going to look at the title, you're going to look at the author. Perhaps if you're like me, I look at how many pages a particular text is so that I can begin to break up my reading process over a period of time, because I know myself I cannot sit down and read, 300 or 400 pages in one sitting. I read the title. Um, Think about what that title might say about the book. You start to begin to connect your prior knowledge to a particular topic that the title might infer. Evaluate the author, or at least get to know the author. It's interesting to understand sometimes the author's biography, where they are, what they've done. It brings a little bit of life into the text for you. Activate prior knowledge. So, what is it about this particular topic you already know? Or in some cases, it might be, I don't know anything about this particular topic. So, what might you do in order to perhaps begin to build some prior knowledge? Could you do a simple Google it before you begin reading? Or you could begin reading, understanding that perhaps you will need to, along the way, maybe take some brief breaks if you're not able to really connect to the content. Decide what you need to know. What is it that you want to know as a result of engaging with this text? And we're going to get to that, or we're going to look at an example of what you might do with that in just a minute. So let's talk about during the reading process. And here we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. Because many times in that passive sense, we may read, but we don't write anything down. We don't annotate anything. We're not making notes in the text. We're not highlighting anything. Perhaps we come to an unknown word and it may impede our ability to really connect to the text, but we kind of skip it, right? If we're active in that process, we're going to be looking for some key points and answers to questions. Now, these questions are questions that you may have, not necessarily questions that you've been quote unquote assigned to, right? But as active readers, you want to engage yourself into a text. So you can ask yourself certain questions before you begin. Highlight, annotate, and take notes. And I cannot stress that enough. And we saw that quick commercial in our last video where we talked about the fact that those particular activities, whether it be taking notes or highlighting and annotating, allow us to be active in that process, right? In essence, you are talking to the text. Find meanings of new vocabulary words. Now, this is interesting because it doesn't necessarily mean that you stop and go look up a word, because that can be very disruptive to our reading process. But when we look for meanings of new vocabulary words, we first want to see if there's anything in the context of that word or on that page that might help us better understand the word. That way we don't have to stop. Typically, I say that we understand words along this continuum. On one end of the continuum, it is I've never seen this word before, and if I don't stop and look it up, I am not going to be able to move forward with this text. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, where it is I understand this word in multiple contexts and I can use it all over the place. Typically, we're somewhere in between, but if you do find yourself on that beginning end where that word is going to be the difference between being able to move forward and understanding what was read, or not being able to understand it, then you would stop and attend to that word. Many of the times you might briefly pause, but you're able to kind of figure out the meaning of the word in the context, using perhaps some of the general sense of what's around it. Perhaps the author has defined the word in some way. Perhaps there's a synonym or antonym located near it that will help you decipher that. And that allows you to keep reading without stopping. Finally, you want to connect to the text. And this happens along the way, not necessarily just after, but as you're reading, there's going to be pieces and parts you're going to connect to in different ways. So you want to definitely make note of those because it helps you engage better with the content and with the author. So when we think about this during reading process, we think about highlighting and annotating. And you see this kind of fuzzy picture, but you've got highlights on the text itself, and then you've got annotations on the side, right? So highlighting allows you to find it quickly. It makes it visible, right? So you're going to use the highlighter sparingly because you only want it to highlight those pieces and parts that you're trying to find later on. Now what happens is if we don't annotate it, if we don't if we don't tell the highlights what they're for, then when you go back to look at that and you just see highlights with no annotations, you're not going to understand the context you were thinking at that time as you highlighted. So always think about the highlights as a way to pull out the text into a visible sense, and the annotations are there to help me remember why I highlighted something in the first place. It could have been that I was defining a word. It could have been that I was connecting to a concept. It could have been me simply asking the question to an author, or it could be me disagreeing or agreeing with the author. And sometimes it's me highlighting a piece and I simply say, I need to go back and unpack this further, right? So I kind of mark that spot. Whatever your methods are, the highlighting and annotating allow you to really be able to pull some of that text or information out. And that's going to become important as you begin to write longer pieces where you're using multiple sources in what you write. And the last thing you want to do is have to go back in and reread multiple texts before you get ready to write. So these steps that we do with regards to highlighting and annotating, and later on we'll talk about summarizing or creating some kind of perhaps annotated bibliography that might help you refer to them later. So I always think about this as talking to your text as you go. Um, Again, highlighting makes the information easily visible, and the annotating allows you to add those notes or comments, perhaps definitions to unfamiliar vocabulary words, even writing questions that you have from your reading. But I do say this, I never have one without the other. There's never a highlight without an annotate or vice versa. Because if I'm annotating, I'm connecting it to a specific piece in the text, and I want to know where that specific piece was. And if I'm highlighting, I've got to add the annotation so I know what it was that I was referring to or what I was thinking at that time. So you definitely want to have both highlighting and annotation. So now let's talk about the after part. If I'm a passive reader, I kind of close the book and I walk away. Now, that doesn't necessarily make you passive in the sense that if you close the book and never think of it again, many times after we've closed the book, perhaps it is because we need to walk away and think about it, which is completely fine. But if I'm active, I'm going to look at this text differently, right? I'm going to analyze and evaluate the text. Maybe I'm going to develop some kind of graphic organizer or visual representation of connection of the pieces and parts within a text that might help me pull out that information. One of the very valuable pieces to do is to write a summary. Close the book, don't look at it, and write the summary. Just use what you understood about the book, right? Talk about what it was that the author was doing, how the author did it, what support they used, what did you notice. But do this in a way so that you write it in your own words and don't rely on the text just yet, okay? It's a way to kind of think about where you are with regards to comprehending that text. And perhaps in that summary or underneath it, you're going to write some connections, some specific connections to that text. It could be, again, a connection that you personally have, meaning it reminded you of something in your own lived experiences. It could be a connection to something that you have read before. Um, it could be a connection to something that you've seen, perhaps on the internet, in social media, on the news, something that might be happening in current events. Being able to connect to the text is going to be very important, especially, again, as you begin to write longer pieces and you're doing research. You're going to want to know how those chosen sources talk to each other, right? If they were at a dinner table, what kind of conversation would they have? Would they agree with each other? Would they disagree with each other? And that's all centered around this understanding of connecting to the text. So now let's move into the actual reading process and mining the text. And this is going to springboard us into our first article. So when we mine the text, what do? We're pulling things out of it, right? You're pulling information out, and we're going to do that using those highlighting, annotating strategies as well as that note-taking piece. So when we critically read to mine the text, you're looking for a few things. You're looking for the central point or thesis of a particular text. You're looking for the supporting details. So how does the author develop their evidence or support the evidence to support their central point or thesis? Perhaps vocabulary words. Again, these vocabulary words are yours, so they're your personal kind of lexicon or word wall. So what would you like in there? Are they words that you want to use in a subsequent writing, or are they words that you don't understand or you want to understand better? You also want to be looking for those connections like we talked about earlier. Questions. Never, ever fear questioning the author or questioning a text. They're your questions. So put them down, ask them. And then I always say quotable quotes. And I love quotable quotes because I usually will pull them out of a text and put them somewhere, usually underneath my summary and connection piece that I write. Because those quotable quotes could be something that you might use later on in a writing as evidence, right? But these quotable quotes, you'll also hear me say they're kind of like aha moments. What is it in that text that spoke to you or that you connected with? And that's maybe where you get those quotable quotes. When we look for evidence to support a central point, a thesis, or an argument, we look at it in terms of what are the reasons, examples, perhaps data, facts, testimonial, observations. In other words, what is the author doing in the text or using in the text to support their overall central point or thesis, right? Sometimes there'll be personal observation or anecdotes. Sometimes the text is going to require that they give you data and facts and specific examples, perhaps testimonials from experts in the field, or in the case of one that we're getting ready to read, other colleagues. So you're just looking for that evidence, that kind of bundle of evidence to support their central point. So there's a couple of questions you can ask yourself as you enter a text that will help guide this process. And these are some kind of tried and true great questions to start with. One is to ask yourself or to find the subject or topic of the text, right? So what's that overall topic? Is it talking about a specific event in history? Is it talking about a specific theory or philosophy, or a specific subject matter in an academic sense? So find that topic or subject. Then you want to find out what the author is doing with the topic or subject, right? And this leads you to their central point. And I always think of it in this way. In this text, the author does what with regards to that topic or subject? Are they comparing and contrasting? Are they just discussing? Are they arguing a certain piece? Okay, so that's going to lead you to that central point. And then you want to look at how does the author support his or her central point thesis argument, depending on the paper, how you might use one of those words. So in essence, what are you doing? You're trying to find the subject, you're trying to find what the author's doing with the subject, and how the author supports their central point. So now it's your turn. We're going to be engaging in this first article. It's called Shitty First Drafts. It's by Anne Lamott. She's an interesting author, so if you don't know who she is, I would say go ahead and Google her before you begin. But this particular article is linked in the Canvas module on the page, same page as this video. So in just a few minutes when we get finished, you're going to go ahead and pull that article up and begin engaging with it. Before you do that though, as you read, let me give you some kind of guiding purpose points, for lack of better words, that might help you engage with the annotations and highlights. The first is, what is she doing with this text? So think about what her purpose is. What is she doing? What is she communicating with this text? How does she do it? In other words, what does she give her audience to make her points? So it parallels very much with those questions, right? You're trying to think about what the central point is. You're trying to think about the evidence to support. Then I want you to think about, where were your aha moments in this text? Kind of make note of them. Were there certain quotes or concepts that she did that help you connect to it or provide that aha moment? And then I want you to think about, after you've read, how does this text impact the writing process that you reflected on earlier, right? So I want you to engage with this article in this way, using these 4 guiding questions as you make notes or highlight or annotate before you complete the assignment that is linked to this video. Again, you have this video available to you at all times, so you can watch it over and over again if you would like. Thank you for watching. Now you can head back to Canvas to continue this week's module, and we will see you online.